In this third PowerPoint about the topic of race and racism, we will see the validity of the concept of race as we define it. Does it really exist? We'll see different views from physical anthropology and genetics and from cultural anthropology. Just a little reminder from physical anthropology. The understanding of human DNA is very recent. Only recently we understood the mechanisms of mutations and their role in evolution. Even more recently, we have mapped the human genome, and this work is not even 100% complete. So these are very recent discoveries. Also, on the side of cultural anthropology, you know that the concept of race was developed for many reasons. And one of the reasons, one of the important reasons, is because it was very useful for some economically dominant groups in recent history. It was important to justify and to excuse the enslavement and the colonization and the exploitation of some other populations of different racial backgrounds. So let's start with biological anthropology, physical anthropology. Do races exist as biological entities? As we tend to define races in our Western mind, there's white Europeans, there's sub-Saharan Africans, we call black, we call some people Asians and Native Americans or First Nations from the Americas. We tend to group them in a single racial group. We tend to classify people from India and the Pacific Islands as a separate race. This is not even clear, but we do some divisions in our Western mind. Uh, do these races really exist? Huh? Human variation does exist. Visible human variation. It is there before our eyes. It's visible, it is obvious. But physical anthropologists claim that race, as we define it, skin color, body shape, hair shape, is not a biologically meaningful concept. There is no biological basis for having the race classification we do have based on the phenotype. Phenotype means physical aspect, physical expression of what is written in our genes, in our DNA. There is not, to our knowledge now, there is not a biological marker that would be present in one race and absent from all other races as we do define race. So skin color, body shape, hair shape, eye shape, things that we deem very important in racial classification are not important genetically. We'll see that. Other characteristics like our resistance to disease, our ability to digest milk or alcohol would be more meaningful in separating people in different physical groups. If we consider, as we define race in the Western world, as whites and blacks and Asians, there is more genetic variation within a race than between races. In other words, someone, and this is especially true for the race we define as black, there is more genetic diversity within people from sub-Saharan Africa than between them and people from other races. It's a concept that's a little bit difficult to grasp. But in other words, someone from sub-Saharan Africa may be genetically much closer to someone from Europe or Asia or Native America than someone else from the same race in sub-Saharan Africa. This population of human beings in sub-Saharan Africa is extremely diverse because different groups there have evolved in separate environments during a very, very, very long time. And what you have seen on the last slide comes from this famous statement on race made by the American Anthropological Association some 20 years ago. They come with these statements that they share with the scientific community, and these statements come from a consensus between anthropologists from different backgrounds. And I highlighted in orange here what would be important, but I encourage you to read that statement. So what would be the genetic markers of race? There is this discovery made 15 years ago at Penn State University. This is an accidental discovery. It was made during investigations for skin cancer to try to find a genetic cause for skin cancer and other genetic diseases. There is a mutation in a gene. You know that a gene is a sequence of a chromosome, a series of nucleotides. There is a mutation on human chromosome 15 that blocks a protein which would allow the accumulation of melanin in cells. You know that nucleotides and genes are responsible for the production of proteins that will make your body as it is. So this protein, this mutation, blocks the accumulation of melanin in cells. Melanin is the pigmentation of human skin. So if your two chromosomes 15, chromosomes come by pairs, if the two of the pair have this mutation on this precise allele in the chromosome, your skin will be very, very pale. If your two chromosomes 15 do not show the mutation, then your skin will be very dark. And if one of your chromosomes 15 shows the mutation, your skin will be in between. So this is one mutation. This is why since then we tend to see pale skin as a mutation, as something that developed in the human genome from a mutation. It is not normal. So, socially we see, unfortunately, the white race as a reference race. And other racial traits would be compared to this one. But the reference race, really, if we consider human evolution in the appearance of Homo sapiens, is the black one. So the biology does not, the sociology here, how we see things in society, does not follow how things are in biology. So this is why some scientists would see white skin as a mutation. That's an abnormality in a structure of a chromosome. And this mutation affects a tiny section of our human genome. I remind you that our chromosomes, we have 26 in each cell. Chromosomes, if you untwist them and untwist and untwist and untwist, you will see, if you have a microscope, this double helix molecule. And if you untwist that double helix, you will see kind of a ladder. It looks like that. It's indicated with the red arrow on the drawing. And each rung of this ladder, it's called a nucleotide. And our human DNA is composed of these nucleotides. This mutation affects one nucleotide on some 3 billion we have in our cells. In each of your cells, you have 3 billion nucleotides, and this mutation that causes pale skin affects one nucleotide on 3 billion. This is not a big fragment of our human genome, but this little fragment, this little nucleotide, as tiny as it is, has caused a lot of problems in human history. There is not only this one mutation that will affect skin color, and now I'm talking only about skin color as an element we use to define racial characteristics, but because it's a major one. We know as of today 6 different genes involved in the variation of human skin color. This is not a lot. You might think that 6 genes is a lot, number 6, but no, in comparison, more than 700 different genes will influence your height as a human being. And this is on top of what the environment is doing. So not a lot in our genetics, in our DNA, influences our skin color. And it became so important socially. Huh? So these 6 genes are there in every human beings, and the variation, these 6 genes might be expressed in many different ways. This is what will affect skin color. All possible variations of that gene are present in peoples from sub-Saharan Africa. All of them are present in one population, the San population. These groups of hunter-gatherers or traditional populations of one region, the Kalahari Desert in Southeast Africa. This is the oldest population on Earth that has stayed on the spot, evolved on the spot during millennia and millennia, and they are the population on Earth that shows the most genetic diversity. But the race, as we define race, that shows all possible variations of genetic diversity is the race we find in some sub-Saharan Africa. The blood of people, the DNA of people we call black, contain everything, contain all possibilities in the variation of human beings. What you see on the picture here are San people. They're very diverse. So if something very bad would happen and a cataclysm would wipe all populations of Earth except some groups of sub-Saharan Africa, they would have all the genetic material in their DNA to renew the genetic diversity and the racial diversity we have on Earth today. And other populations on other continents, other races as we call them, Europeans, Asians, they have lost some parts of this genetic diversity because of many reasons, because of mutations, because of the founder effect of genetic drift, and because of natural selection. So you know all these concepts now. Huh? Our genetic diversity that we call the racial diversity comes from all these factors of variation. So really, we can't say that biologically what we define as a race does really exist, because there is no gene that is found to be present in one and absent from the other. And the phenotype diversity on Earth is constant. There's no line we can trace on when one race ends and the other one starts. There's an infinite variation of human phenotypes, of human physical aspects. Now, what is in this slide and the next one? This is very, very important. So take good notes here. As you know, Homo sapiens appeared in Africa and then migrated millennia after, having evolved on the spot, migrated outside of Africa. With the existence of mutations, of natural selection, of the founder effect, of genetic drift, some traits have appeared. Huh? And as human beings, we have some our traits that are very, very ancient, while some other traits are very, very recent. We acquired them recently in evolution. So the traits that are very, very ancient in human beings evolved on the spot in Africa, in East Africa, before human beings started to migrate elsewhere in Africa and on other continents. They're very ancient. They developed on one spot on Earth before the Great Migrations. So these traits that are so ancient do not vary between populations. They're present equally in all populations because they already existed before the human species got so diverse. And these traits are, for example, bipedalism, walking on 2 feet with in an upright position with a knee that can block, shoulders oriented down, short hip bones. This is present in all human populations. Intelligence, same thing. It developed way before the great human migrations. So this huge brain we have with such complex connections, this big frontal lobe we have, which is the seat of judgment, it is a very ancient human trait that is present equally in all human populations. Same thing for motor skills, how we can move our body, our physical abilities, our fine motor skill, how we can do fine movement and very precise movement with our hands, critical thinking, abstract thinking, all sorts of intelligence, creativity, the ability to make art, imagination, all these very important traits we have do not vary from one population to another because they were developed in Homo sapiens before Homo sapiens started to migrate out of its original birthplace. Some other traits are much more recent in Homo sapiens. And very important, they have evolved in modern human and Homo sapiens after Homo sapiens had left their original spot in Africa to spread elsewhere on the planet. So some of them are so recent, they are only a few thousand years old. And these vary a lot between populations. They're all physical traits because physical traits help humans adapting to different physical environments. And they appeared because of local selective pressures that were not the same on every continent, on every environment. You know what the selective pressure is, right? It's a pressure imposed by the environment that will trigger the selection of some mutations, the selection of some traits. Examples: body shape is an important phenotypical trait we consider in our societies. This is the differences of body shape, how our fat is located on our body, the length of our limbs versus the length of our torso, etc. This has developed recently, and this varies between populations. The resistance to particular diseases, they are invisible, but they're still physical traits. And all these traits we call racial traits: hair shape, eye shape, skin color. This is extremely recent in the development of variation between humans. Now, do races exist as social entities? Yes, they do exist in society. We create races according to what our society tells us, shows us. Races are considered social constructions. And you know what a social construction is. It's a notion that depends on the collective acceptance by a group. It depends on the society that creates it, and it would not exist if it was not collectively created and accepted. The first example that shows that race is a social construction is the rule of hypodescent in the US. You have read about hypodescent, you know what it is now. Hypodescent arranged racial categories into a kind of hierarchy from the most prestigious racial group to the least prestigious racial group. The most prestigious on top would be considered the white race here. So children with parents from different races are automatically here given the racial identity of the least prestigious race of the parents. During slavery, children were taking the racial status of their mother, even in case of, well, especially in case of mixed race children. So, for example, if a child had a white mother and a black father, the child was considered white and free. But if the same child with the same kind of background had a black mother and a white father, the child was considered a slave, taking the status of his mother. So white men were kind of free of responsibility towards their mixed race children. Strict boundaries were maintained between racial groups. But interestingly here, the same person, the same child with the same racial background could be considered belonging to two totally different races, just depending of the race of the mother. So it shows like how you put a race on a person really is determined by culture rather than by biology. But rules were maintained very strict after slavery ended, because suddenly white Americans became pretty anxious about their privileges, about the future of their race, because before slavery ended, white privilege was something really given to people belonging to the so-called white race. But suddenly now, people from other racial backgrounds had the same privileges. This is why white Americans became anxious, because if you share your privileges with so many people, you're diluting the privileges. You become less privileged. So this anxiety around made the rule of hypodescent very important. It placed mixed race people into the non-white group. So the privileges were not given to them. It was kept for white Americans. So conveniently, mixed race citizens were classified as black. And this was a mandatory rule. It was not a question of personal choice. Hypodescent and laws regarding hypodescent led to what we call the one-drop rule that was in effect in many states in the US and used until the 1970s. Even it was present in laws in Louisiana until 1985. This means the one-drop rule means that it depended on which state. If one of your 32 direct ancestors, or even one of your 64 direct ancestors, depending on the states, was not white, you were not white as a person. So you needed a kind of a pure white ancestry to be considered white. So it's a very good example of how races really are a social construction. It's a question of math and fractions here. An interesting case was Susie Phillips, as you see her on the picture on the left. She was an American citizen, and she applied for a passport to travel in the 1970s. And when she retrieved her birth certificate for her passport application, she discovered, to her big surprise, that she was not white, because 3 on 32 of her ancestors were not white. So she was classified as colored. And she thought she didn't know that. So this is really the social construction of race that we have here. And we still have this perception of hypodescent a little bit. Even today, famous people like Barack Obama are seen as black, but his mother's white. So we always see the non-white side of a person first. Example number 2, races are fluid and unstable. The notion of race always changes throughout history. How we classify people into races changes all the time. For example, in the United States, race categories in the official census have changed much more than the racial composition of the US population. So it shows that how we deal with race does not depend on how the physical diversity is arranged around us. This picture illustrates that situation very well. Each person here has a t-shirt showing 3 different dates in the US history and their own racial classification in each of these dates. And most of the time, it does change, the classification does change, but the person does not change. Example number 3, the notion of what a race is and how we made racial division. This notion changes from place to place, from country to country. It varies between cultures, and it even changes from person to person within the same culture. That's a very personal and subjective thing. How we classify races tells about our culture and how we were raised. You have read about folk taxonomies. Folk taxonomies are classifications that are not based on science. You have read about folk taxonomies in the US and in Brazil. And I have another example of that, how the notion of race is subjective. Each year, when I really teach on campus, I print the pictures of all players of a basketball team or soccer team, depending on what's in the news. And a few years ago, the San Antonio Spurs had won the cup in the NBA. So I printed the pictures of all players of the Spurs, and I asked students in the class to, be in teams and classify the players according to the race to which they belong. And students always have a lot of difficulties doing that. They don't agree, this guy, which race does he belong to? And after that exercise, we compare what teams have done. And I never ever had 2 teams with the same racial classification of the players. And we all come from the same background here. And we classify races in different ways. And an interesting example was the player Tony Parker. He was classified in a different race by each of the teams. He was classified white and black and Latino and Arab by different teams of students. So it's another good example of how we classify races, we define it according to our culture. This is very, very subjective. What I'm explaining here is called the social constructionist approach on race. It means that the classification we make of what we call races is not a real classification. It's not based on science. And it's based on personal perception. It's based on local culture. And in the past, throughout history, it has been used to justify, to rationalize the unequal treatment we give to other populations, the exploitation we make of people of different places.